Hello and welcome. Today I have the pleasure to be joined by Professor Robert Shiller, a Nobel Prize in Economics and a Professor of Economics at Yale University. Thank you so much for being with us, Professor Shiller.
My pleasure.
So as I said, happy to have you here because I would really like to discuss with you what's going on in the world at the moment. We are going through one of the worst health crises and economic crisis ever. Where is this going now? Where are we going from here?
Well, I think that the forecasting involves a lot of variables, but I'm notably trying to emphasize the change in narratives that surround events as a force in itself. There's a tendency to want to look at concrete causes. Now, this event has a very important concrete cause, namely the coronavirus. But the effect on the economy is not just a reaction to the coronavirus. We had a recession in 1918 that was caused in part by the influenza epidemic, but it was very mild. It was different. So why was it different? And that has to do with narratives, what people are talking about.
And this is a very interesting point. So you think that this crisis does not compare to the crisis we had in 1929, the Great Depression, or even probably the Great Financial Crisis of 2007, 2009. And this is mostly due to the so-called narrative. Is that so?
Yeah, in 1929, the stock market crash was interpreted by people then as a very bad omen. That the supposed prosperity of the 1920s was illusory and that there was a lot of manipulation going on, among other narratives. The narrative is completely different now. There's a populist narrative spreading around much of the world, and it has different connotations in different places. So, for example, we have a very strong stock market in the United States, less so in Europe, and that has something to do with the political atmosphere differences across countries. But my recent book, Narrative Economics, really only makes a start in answering such questions. It's difficult to follow the extent of all the narratives that impact on markets.
And actually talking about your recent book, which is called Narrative Economics, and you describe how stories go viral and drive major economic events. Obviously, this is a very topical issue right now, but you wrote it in 2019, so you did not expect this to come, probably.
Yes, I thought I was one of the very few economists who had any interest in contagion or epidemiology, and I was trying to draw attention to it. But the coronavirus was a much more powerful attention grabber. And now everyone in the world is talking about epidemic curves and contagion rates. I think it should have been under our radar all along. One thing I do in the book is lament the compartmentalization of our knowledge, that we tend to belong to specific departments or we have specific interests. And that prevents us from the economics people from learning from the epidemiology people. And so we're kind of in separate universes. I'm trying to bring these things together or urge people to be more cosmopolitan in their views and less career-oriented in their research. People in economics have generally thought, it's not just in economics, it's in all disciplines, I don't need to study the other disciplines. There are able people doing that in other departments. I don't have to know anything about it. And so they don't know anything. But I think that what we've been seeing in the economies of the world is very heavily influenced by a number of different narratives pulling in different directions. and changing our thinking.
And as you said, you were talking about already then in 2019, you were already talking about contagion, epidemiology. So again, you probably didn't see this pandemic coming, but you saw something, coming. And now we can look at the contagion of financial anxiety versus contagion of the virus. But the two are strongly interconnected, obviously. Can this lead to risk aversion or the irrational, exuberance of the markets, as we see in some part of the world, the US mostly, as opposed to what we see in the rest of the world, Europe mostly?
Well, the coronavirus epidemic has had different effects on different people, but on a lot of people, it was giving them a kind of sense of vulnerability. They saw the grocery stores running out of things like toilet paper, among other things. The things that you wouldn't think of worrying about and suddenly become worries. And that was part of the reason, I think, for the drop in the stock markets between February and March of this year. And so people were, they were living in a world where we're running out and where there's death around the corner. That lasted only for a month, though, and markets have stopped falling, and in some cases have done really well, like the United States market, which has become the most expensive market in the world, has somehow gotten a kind of optimism in the midst of all of this. A new sort of optimism developed after March of this year. And it, I think, related to narratives about the most recent previous crisis, the 2007-2009 crisis, or the Great Recession, as it's been called, because people remember, and they're now starting to talk about, the V-shaped recovery, that, you wanted to get back into the market in time. And that narrative took hold, that maybe there was an overreaction to the COVID crisis. And then it propelled the market upward, and then more and more people piled onto this view. It wasn't really a fundamentally optimistic view. It was still tinged with anxiety. But among people who trade in the markets, it was a view that that dominated their actions. A fear of missing out developed. That most people are thinking frequently about the stock market, or at least people who invest in it, and wondering whether this is the time to get in. And as the market went up, they thought, I missed the turning point, but at least I can get in now. And that's been the prevailing narrative for recent months. Until just lately, we've seen some declines. And so it's a complicated story. But it's complicated because people refresh certain narratives depending on circumstances and are pulled down by other versions of the narrative. It's a complicated system of narratives or a constellation of narratives that dominate our thinking. And I think that the reason the stock market and the economy, not just the stock market or the bond market, the reason they're so hard to forecast is that there are so many narratives all at the same time, growing like epidemics or declining like the end of epidemics, all at the same time. So for example, global warming, fear of that, it could have been really bad in recent months with forest fires being in the news caused by global warming, apparently. But that has kind of taken a back seat. The coronavirus is more immediately engaging. It has been most of the time. And somehow it has propelled the market upward.
Exactly, and this is what you actually call the irrational exuberance already, 2 decades ago. Now what we see probably is mostly an irrational behavior, as said, because there is loads and loads of volatility. Probably we have never seen so much volatility in the market, and also, is divided by geographical areas, as we said before. But at this point, how easy or how difficult it is to forecast what the market is going to do in the next 3 months, in the next 6 months? When do you see a return to investments, for example?
Yeah, I think that forecasting at this stage in history is mostly long-term, that you can predict that the economy will eventually return to trend. The stock market will stabilize for a while anyway at a normal level. But you can't time the market accurately at this time in history. And I'm not just talking about stock market investments, it's about people's decisions, whether to save or whether to pursue education, whether to branch out into a new or different field. And these decisions also depend on things that are very difficult to forecast. Or even for young people, what to major in college, what to specialize in. It's hard to say. And that people have to make a decision somehow.
And this looks like it is and it's going to be in the future a new enemy other than a new reality, because it will be difficult to forecast what we are going to, have around the corner, what's going to be around the corner. This said, do you think that this crisis is being handled the best way possible? I mean, how are governments and financial institutions, namely central banks, obviously, managing this crisis? Do you think they're doing everything they can to help?
Well, the most important thing to do now with a resurgence of coronavirus is to make sure that people are doing everything possible to mitigate the contagion of the virus. And I don't think that this has been done optimally. And it's coming back in various places. And it could get as bad as it was the last time early at the beginning of this year. So that is the foremost thing, that the central banks can't directly stop the coronavirus. It takes participation of everyone. It takes people willing to not do things like go to plays or concerts or sports events in person because they're a place of contagion. People are depressed because of the isolation and the effect on business. So I think that it might get worse in the coming months. We'll have to see. But if it does get worse, it's not just because of any change in the coronavirus. It's the change in what we do as people.
And this goes back to what you say in your book, Narrative Economics, because basically you explain how our emotions drive financial decisions, but not only financial decisions, more or less all kinds of decisions, I suppose. Even in this case, obviously, we are discussing markets and economy. Now, can you tell me, we are at a very important milestone of our story, mostly in the United States, with the presidential elections around the corner. But with the latest news about Donald Trump being affected by coronavirus, how is this going to change the elections? How is this going to change the game now? What do you expect?
Yes. The question is, will this decrease or increase support for Donald Trump and in the United States? And that depends on how it's spun and how Donald Trump is a very successful public speaker. And he's already tried to interpret his illness as a sign of his heroism, and that he wouldn't avoid meeting the people. He was putting his life at risk. And so he's the hero. And I'm sure that attitude has some sway to it. But the other side of it, there's another narrative about it also at the same time, that it shows how wrong he was about the virus. And it makes him look like a fool to have gone without wearing masks all this time. And now he's caught it. Which of those two narratives wins out is difficult to say. This is why it's so difficult to forecast elections and forecast markets, because the impact of events can have different signs, different plus or minus before it. It seems like it's nobody's specialty to really study the whole array of narratives that are circulating, some of them in the news media and some of them just by word of mouth or social media, and figure out what the net effect is likely to be on voting or on spending or on new investments. All of these things are difficult to forecast.
Exactly. Let's say that 2020 is the year of black swans, of unexpected events, I could say.
If you look at the history of GDP, and I'm speaking of the United States, this is the sharpest decline ever. Our GDP fell by over 10% in real per capita terms in the first half of this year. The Great Depression wasn't so fast. It wasn't so sharp. Although it ultimately went down more like 25% in GDP. And so it's not as big or as bad as the Great Depression, but it sets a record in a different way. It was a very sharp contraction. And it depends on how the narratives play out about it. So you could say a very sharp contraction proves that it was just a physical thing. It wasn't the Great Depression again. Or you could develop a narrative that this looks even worse than the Great Depression. And again, it depends on storytelling and how successful people with different interests will spin various interpretations of the story.
So who are going to be the main leaders of this rebound? Are they the presidential elections, the markets exuberance, the central banks with the stimulus? I mean, what is going to really lead the rebound?
Well, there's two kinds of leaders. There are the people who come up with new narratives and invent a kind of choice words to describe them. They're like good writers. But they aren't the ones who get credit for the narrative usually. People who are skilled in the art of influencing people are listening around for narratives and observing the reaction of others. And if they see something that looks good and powerful, they will bless it with their name, not giving credit to the person who started it. And then it becomes a powerful narrative named after the wrong person. But powerful narratives do benefit from celebrity endorsement. They won't spell it as endorsement. They'll say celebrity genius. And they'll be given credit for ideas that somebody else developed.
And let's say that this is probably also why now things are very different from a century ago, because now we have not only the media, but social media, and they are completely different from what we had, again, in 1929 or 1918 when we had the so-called Spanish flu. Now, talking about, again, the narrative economy, how strongly linked is to this new pandemic economy?
Well, this pandemic economy is a kind of a first in history. We had a similarly bad pandemic, as I mentioned, in 1918, but the narrative was clouded then by the end of World War I, and that was such a powerful narrative that it more or less crowded out. There was still a lot of talk about the pandemic, but there was a crowding out of public feeling about it. The 1918 narrative involved a fake news story that the German government had created the influenza epidemic. This is just fake news from back then. And the story was that Germany was losing World War I and needed to develop something and hope that it tips the balance of the war. that wasn't true. It wasn't the German government who started that epidemic. But I think the sense of end of the war created a sense of optimism that prevented the 1919 recession from getting bad. So we don't have that sort of event. Thankfully, we don't have a world war on the way now. And so the story is different. So if it remains a story about coronavirus and we develop a vaccine and therapy, as we seem to be doing, it shouldn't develop into another Great Depression.
And hopefully we don't have another world war coming. Hopefully, everything is going to be fine. But just to conclude this great conversation, Professor Shiller, if I can ask you, obviously you said it's impossible to forecast now what's going to happen. It's difficult to know what's happening in 2021 at this point, but would you be able just to tell me what is your vision of the new post-COVID reality when it comes to economics and to financial markets?
I'm a natural-born optimist, and I think that the coronavirus will be not totally defeated, but will be reduced to a less risky situation. But I do worry still about the anxiety that people are facing and the sense of depression that people have. It could bring back old narratives, and we could have a bad outcome.
Well, Professor Shiller, thank you so much for your optimism at this point, or I should say cautious optimism.
Yeah, that's a good word, cautious optimism.
Okay, fantastic.
Science is on our side, and they will develop a way of managing this virus. So it won't go away completely, but we'll be less afraid of it. And that should bring us back. It might not, but let's emphasize the positive now.
Professor Shiller, thank you so much for being with us. It has been a real pleasure. Professor Robert Shiller, Nobel Prize in Economics and Professor of Economics at Yale University. Thank you so much.
My pleasure too.